Obviously, it's still 4 years away, but we're already getting ahead of this curve on that tour. So, okay, without further ado, tonight we have one of our own from Illinois on one of the great generals of the Civil War, President Grant's, General Grant's right-hand man. And, you know, Allen has written a great book. If you haven't had a chance to read his book yet, on John Rawlins. And again, Allen Ottens is a professor emeritus at Northern Illinois University. He worked as a psychologist at several universities, counseling centers. He is also the past president of the Manuscript Society. Okay. He also went to Riverside Brookfield High School, and he graduated a year before my mother-in-law. I asked if he knew my mother-in-law, and he said, "I think I do." So, my mother-in-law, I'm not here to get in trouble. I've already texted my wife if my mother-in-law knows him. But of course, you know, in your high school, one class is be 100 years different. You know, she graduated a year after Allen did from RV High School. So, thought I'd throw that in there, Allen. Hope you don't mind. He has a lifelong interest in the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, and he is again the author of the award-winning biography on General John Rawlins, No Ordinary Man. Came out in 2021. Okay. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Allen, come on. Bye. Yeah. All right.
Okay, just a second. Let me get you shared up here.
Wait until the PowerPoint comes on. Now, I see a lot of people way in the back. I don't know if you're going to be able to read what's on the screen. So if you want, there's plenty of room up here to move your chairs if you want to get closer so that you can hear me better and see what's on the screen. And nobody's taking advantage of that, so I assume everything's hunky-dory. All right. I think they're pulling this apart. Oh, okay. Well, how do you get rid of that?
Don't exactly know how to do it, but I'll. Hi, there.
Oh, he did look right. This guy is magic.
All right. Can you hear me way back there? Is that okay? Wonderful. Good. I'll try and keep my voice at a good level so that you can hear me and you can stay awake. Right? All right. You're right, Denny. This is my book. It came out about 3 years ago. And a couple of years ago, it won the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Award for Biography. So thank God for that. When I started writing this, anybody in here know Peter Cozzens?
Yeah.
Yeah. Peter was going to write a biography of Rawlins, and we exchanged some emails, and Peter said, "I gave up. Can't do it. No can do." And I said, "Well, I'm going to keep at it." And I did it. And Peter, on the back, was one of the blurbers, okay, for my book. And I'm just gonna say, he said, nor is this an ordinary work of biography. I enthusiastically recommend this book as one of the finest and most important Civil War biographies to appear in recent decades. It is a masterpiece. I didn't pay him to say that. All right. Enough of that. So let's jump into the Grant and Rawlins relationship, which lasted for about 8 years, 1861 to 1869. Rawlins died of tuberculosis. It was on your quiz in September 1869. And during that time, Grant spent more time with Rawlins probably than any other person except individuals in his family. Okay? Nobody was closer to Grant. And they came to regard each other as more than just friends. For example, on his way to try to get to Rawlins before he died, Grant was up in upstate New York at the time. He said, I could not feel the loss of a near and dear relative more keenly than the loss of General Rawlins. Enough said right there. But one of the questions that sticks in our craw and stuck in the craw of many of Rawlins's friends was why, if they were so close, does Grant have hardly anything to say about Rawlins in his memoirs, right? Big mystery. I don't know the answer to that, and a number of people have taken cracks at it, but I'm going to give you my opinion. And you see okay? Oh, that's fine. So in my humble opinion, I think the reason Grant had so little to say about Rawlins in his memoirs was because, and remember, Grant was writing this just months before he was going to die. This was Grant's last chance to really put himself up on a pedestal and show to everybody that he was in control, he knew what he was doing, and that he had the wherewithal to pull off all of his successes. We have to remember at the time that there used to be jokes going around about Rawlins and Grant. And one of the jokes was, if you kick Grant in the head, you knocked out Rawlins' brains. So this, I think, was Grant's last chance to really put himself forward. And I think that's one of the reasons why Rawlins hardly had any role to play in the memoirs. Well, Rawlins also had strong feelings for Grant. In a letter to Representative Washburn, and you're familiar with Elihu Washburn from Galena, right? Hey, how many people have been in Galena, by the way? Oh my God, everybody. Okay. Yeah, I've only been there about 11,000 times. But Rawlins said, no one can feel a greater interest in General Grant than I do. I respect him because I have studied him well, and the more I know him, the more I respect and love him. They had a close bond. But, and this is curious, Grant got to Galena in April 1860, about a year before the war started. So in that year, while Grant was in Galena, he and Rawlins had very little contact. Grant really minded his own business, except for the business in the leather store downtown. He kept a low profile. And where Rawlins and Grant came into contact from time to time was because Rawlins had been hired as the attorney for Grant's leather store in Galena. In fact, Rawlins even said later on he had no inkling that Grant had any liking for him. In fact, in Galena, Grant and Rawlins were at completely different levels. Rawlins was one of the city aldermen, was the city attorney, belonged to two of the upper echelon lodges in town. And if you were anybody, you had to belong to one of those lodges. He was often referenced in local papers, and he even made kind of a funny joke about Grant to his friend David Sheenan, referring to Grant as a queer, peculiar kind of man. But for some reason, Grant was eager to give an invitation to Rawlins to join his staff. And that invitation went out just 2 days after Grant got his Brigadier General star. And to me, it was kind of funny that Grant would want to extend this offer, because it was well known that Rawlins's wife was deathly ill. She had consumption, which was to kill Rawlins 8 years later. So the question might be, why would you invite somebody to join your staff when you've got 3 kids and their mother is on her deathbed, right? A little odd. Well, what motivated Grant? It might have been Rawlins's impassioned speech right after Fort Sumter at the Galena courthouse, where for 45 minutes he went on a tear, saying that the time for compromise was over. We've got to go to war and give it to these unpatriotic folks down in Dixie. It was a great speech. And Grant was there in the audience. Well, did Grant offer Rawlins a job on his staff because he was presumably considered for an appointment as a major in the new regiment being formed? It became the Lead Mine Regiment. Was it because Rawlins was such an exemplary citizen? Or did Grant just feel comfortable with Rawlins? A mystery to this day. But there's a picture of them. Grant joined the staff in September of 1861, and a month later, Grant and his staff posed for photos. And there's Rawlins in the upper right-hand corner, the 2 aides-de-camp on the left, and the medical director down on the bottom right. So thus began a legendary partnership. Rawlins followed Grant from Cairo, Illinois, on into the White House. He served as the AAG, Chief of Staff, Secretary of War, advisor, report writer, counselor, administrator, the guy who was chosen for sensitive missions, provider of personal support. He was also the one who possessed quite a very profanity, a bunch of profanity that he would use. So he was the assertive voice on the staff. Now, the thing that I think, impressed me more than anything about Rawlins, my last point there. Remember, Rawlins was a Democrat in Galena and an avid follower of Stephen Douglas. And if you study Douglas, you know that Douglas was racist to the core, believed that blacks were inferior to whites, did not have the mental capacity to vote. However, Rawlins really became, toward the end of his life, an uplifting voice for the formerly enslaved, talking up voting rights, educational rights. This was quite a turnaround and quite impressive in my estimation. All right. But be that as it may, what do we always associate Rawlins and Grant with? Rawlins, the guy that kept Grant sober. All right. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about this relationship between Grant-Rawlins and liquor, but in ways that you've likely never considered. Okay? And I'm going to conclude my talk with what Adam Badeau regarded as the hallmark of Rawlins's relationship with Grant. Adam Badeau was Grant's military secretary, and I think we're in for a surprise there. It certainly surprised me when I did my research on this. All right. Well, did Grant have a drinking problem? Well, we pretty much know he had a hard time with more than one drink. He had a low tolerance for alcohol, so he could be, with 2 drinks would put him out. But I think the bigger problem with alcohol and Grant was how others would use the problem to undercut Grant or to put him at a disadvantage. A lot of people at that time realized that Grant was pretty much drummed out of the service for some drinking issues. And this was a keen way to get back at him. So I think other people used it to his disadvantage. So who were some of the folks who might try to undercut Grant and spread rumors or malicious gossip or lies about Grant's drinking? Well, folks like McLernan, Rosecrans, Halleck, could add Buell to that list. But on the other hand, people who spent the most time with Grant, such as his division and corps commanders and individuals from his staff, had a different perspective. They either were bothered by his drinking or didn't see it to be a problem. During the Donaldson campaign, our friend James McPherson heard about all these rumors circulating around St. Louis. And who was in charge at St. Louis at that time? Halleck, right? And McPherson said, well, all sorts of reports are coming out of St. Louis as to General Grant's habits. It's said that he is drinking terribly and in every way is inefficient. I'm fond of him, and I want to do him justice. This is a bunch of tripe. Staff member William Rowley, writing to Washburn, said, I have no hesitation in saying that anyone who asserts that he, Grant, is becoming dissipated is either misinformed or else he lies. Rowley was around Grant almost as much at this time as Rawlins was. David Porter, in charge of the naval component at Vicksburg, says, yeah, at dinner wine was served, but Grant didn't drink. He just had a cigar. As was his habit during all the time he was before Vicksburg. Though the same detractors who made false representations of him in military matters, the same people who want to undercut Grant, misrepresented him also in the matter above alluded to. his first chief of staff, Joe Webster, said at Shiloh, and this is where Grant was really raked over the coals for his performance at Shiloh being taken advantage of by surprise. Webster says, I was with him all day. He was perfectly sober and self-possessed during the entire battle. Sherman, after the war, said, yeah, Grant would occasionally drink too much, but not when anything was pending. Okay? So who are we going to believe? Rosecrans, Buell, Halleck, or his staff and Supervision committee? All right. But there was one person in particular who regarded Grant's drinking as both disturbed and disturbing. Disturbed meaning, oh yeah, it's some kind of character flaw in the individual. Grant may have a character flaw inside. And that's disturbing. How the behavior of another person makes someone else uncomfortable or motivated to take corrective action. And who was that person? Our friend John Aaron Rawlins. Okay. Why did he do this? Well, let's examine some factors that caused Rawlins to worry about Grant, the nation, and even himself, leading him to take such steps as to keep Grant a safe distance from alcohol, to deal with critics who wanted to wound Grant, and Rawlins's attempt to apply interventions, as they say, to stay him from falling. Okay? Let me stop right here before we jump into this. Everybody with it so far? Following along? Pace okay? Yeah. All right, good. You can hear it? Wonderful. All right. So let's get into the meat of our talk tonight. All right, let's take a look at some factors that I think really motivated or influenced Rawlins with response to Grant's use of alcohol. Okay. This is, I think, number one. Rawlins saw Grant as the savior of the Union. He saw Grant as the one who could defeat Lee, who could bring the Union back together again. But if Grant went off the rails, my God, it was all over. And Rawlins also believed that Grant was not the master of his appetites. You know what that means? Couldn't control himself. But Grant had more control than most people gave him credit for. All right. In my book, I go into some detail about the spring and summer of 1861. During that time, Grant was trying to get back into the Army, and more than anything, wanted to be given a commission as a colonel so he could lead a regiment. Of course, he knew he had the skills and talent and background to do this, West Point grad and all. But trying to get this caused him all sorts of embarrassment, frustration, boredom, rejection. He worked like hell to try to get this commission, and he kept being turned away. He even went down to Springfield to talk to the Illinois governor, Yates, to try to get Yates to give him a commission. And instead, Yates said, well, you can work for me as a clerk. There's a room back there where you should, you have to take inventory of some of the muskets down here. This was a slap in Grant's face. And then when he did get his regiment, it turned out to be the 7th Congressional District Regiment which was the unruliest bunch in the whole state of Illinois. These were guys, instead of going out on the field and training, they'd rather raid farmers' hen houses, okay? But despite all of this trouble and frustration, you can't find any instance of where Grant found solace in the bottom. All right, second factor. Rawlins believed that there were only two people who could stay Grant from falling. One was his wife, Julia. The other one was Rawlins himself. And I think Rawlins had an inflated sense of his importance in that regard. Factor three, another factor that influenced Rawlins's approach to intervening on alcohol, I think came about because of Rawlins's own mother, Lovisa. Lovisa was part of the temperance movement. In fact, she held temperance meetings in their home outside of Galena. I found something else in my research that I thought was interesting. Rawlins's mother was born 2 years after and one county removed from this massive 1801 Cane Ridge revival meeting that occurred there, which was attended by something like 20,000 people listening to preachers speaking in tongues, having jerking motions, overcome with the spirit of the Holy Ghost. I have to believe that in some respect, Lovisa's family was influenced by this revival meeting because the revival itself ushered in what was called the Second Great Awakening, which launched the anti-slavery and temperance movements. And here his mother comes from that same area, okay? Factor four, I think his father acted as a negative role model, all right? Father James Dawson Rawlins was a good old Southern boy, all right? And he could imbibe, but we know that by the 1850s, he cut back significantly on his drinking. I've got some theories as to why that was the case in my book. Hint, hint. One reason why you should buy it. His father had a low need to achieve. This guy would be happy just hunting turkey. Now, what's interesting is that there are a number of historians who brand Rawlins's father as a hopeless inebriate, but I think they do him a big disservice because as I got to know him, I find he was really quite active in the township politics and in local affairs. There was even a postal station at their house. He was well liked by his grandkids. He lived into his 90s. He was 92 or 93 when he died. And also, he didn't have the feel of a dry drunk. You know, a person who quits drinking but still sits on a mountain of unresolved personal issues, and you can tell, ooh, something's wrong with this guy. He just doesn't feel right, okay? A fifth factor, Rawlins attended the Rock River Seminary, an institution of higher learning in Mount Morris, Illinois. And this college really cracked down on drinking and gambling and carousing. So this is what Rawlins was associated with, a college that had no room for misbehavior. All right, this is a sixth factor. And I'm going to tell you, Rawlins wrote a letter to his second wife. And this convoluted sentence is in there. And I must have read that damn thing 150 times. And I said to myself, in there is a big clue as to what how Rawlins and alcohol come together. All right? I'll read it. It's really crazy. I tell you, my dearest Emma, unless the blighting shadow of intemperance had hung like a pall over one's pathway all his life, and the consummation of his fondest hopes, and made him, from its continuous presence, fear to ask himself the question, am I to die a drunkard? He can poorly appreciate my feelings on this subject. I had to tear this damn thing apart. Okay? And let me tell you what I found. It's worth the price of a book.
That's good. I like it.
Here we go. In an agonized voice, I think, Rawlins is saying that he risks dying a drunkard's death due to his father's intemperance. What's that about? Well, at that time, there was a theory. It's now known by the term progressive hereditary degeneration that held that vices such as gluttony, sexual deviancy, and gluttony are passed to offspring. Okay? So if you're a glutton, look out, because your kids are going to be gluttons or sexual deviants or whatever, right? There's more than that. And that the expression of those vices intensifies with each succeeding generation to the point where a family loses its ability to procreate. They just are wiped out eventually, genetically. It's very much akin to the theological notion that the sins of the father redound to the destruction of the sons. Okay? And I think Rawlins believed this. If you believe this, and if you love the guy you're working under, Grant, do you want to see his seed destroyed? I don't think so. Right? There's more to this. Again, I pulled this up because I buried myself in some old newspapers. And my wife will attest to that. All right. Prior to this progressive hereditary degeneration, there was another pseudoscience. You're familiar with phrenology, right? Bumps on the head, you can read a person's personality. Well, phrenologists posited that excessive indulgence in those vices resulted in moral depravity. All right, but progressive hereditary degeneration took it further. Now, here's the kicker. Rawlins studied law in Galena under the local attorney named Isaac Stevens. Stevens was a founder of the Galena Phrenological Society that existed briefly, and he had a keen interest in phrenology. So, what do you think? During a slow time in the law office, do you think Stevens and Rawlins talked about the effect of drinking on a person's behavior or capacity or personal characteristics? I sure think so. Okay? All right. And I think there's another factor that we want to consider with regard to Rawlins and his attitude toward drinking. And my research suggests that Rawlins's approach to assessing and intervening with regard to Grant's drinking was significantly influenced by the work of Reverend Lyman Beecher and his 6 sermons on intemperance. Beecher was, at that time, early 19th century, middle of the 19th century, probably one of the key figures in the temperance movement. All right. And he wrote 6 sermons, delivered 6 sermons on intemperance. And those sermons were put together in a book in about 1832 that had wide circulation. I have to believe that Rawlins read that book. His mother had it. And Rawlins probably read it when he was at the Mountain Morris Seminary in college. All right. Let's see how this 7th factor played out in a critical situation that involved Grant, Rawlins, and Representative Washburn. All right. To understand this, we have to go back to December 1861. And malicious rumors at that time are abounding in St. Louis about Grant's drinking. This is what McPherson was talking about in the previous slide. Well, who started these malicious rumors? Were they detractors who were second-guessing Grant's decision to attack at Belmont back in November? Because there were a lot of people that thought Grant got his rear end whipped, okay? Were the rumors being started by crooked contractors who were upset that Grant wanted to thwart their schemes? Remember at that time, these contractors were selling emaciated cattle, or boots that would fall apart during the first rain. And Grant wanted to put a stop to that. At any rate, a Galena businessman was in St. Louis at this time, and he heard these rumors. And he took pen in hand and wrote Washburn and said, Congressman Washburn, look out, these rumors are starting. You better get Rawlins and inform him about this so Rawlins can get to work. All right. Washburn dashes off a letter to Rawlins wanting to know more. And Washburn's worried because if these rumors are true, if Grant is an inebriate, this is going to wind up as egg on Washburn's face because Washburn was the guy who recommended Grant for the Brigadier Star. Washburn wants to know what's going on. All right. So Rawlins takes a couple of days to construct a careful response. Now, how did Rawlins reassure Washburn? Well, reassurance number 1, Rawlins says, look, Grant was drinking, yeah, but never much. He only tippled a little bit. And Rawlins took pains to assure Washburn that the amount was only moderate and not worth worrying about. Now, this is where Lyman Beecher's sermons come into play. Rawlins's second reassurance to Washburn was that he'd been watching Grant very carefully, and Grant was not showing any indication of the symptoms of intemperance. Red eyes, foggy intellect, and an inability to follow through on his work. Rawlins says, no, He's not showing any of these. And that's right out of Beecher's sermon number 2. Right out of the book of 6 sermons, taking a cue from sermon number 2, recognizing the 7 symptoms. Reassurance number 3, Rawlins gives Washburn. This is based on Beecher's sermon number 6, in which Beecher describes the interventions that can be taken to knock out alcohol. First, there are societal interventions. All right. To Beecher, societal interventions were things like newspaper editorials that talked against drinking, or preachers from the pulpit. Okay? The second type of intervention was person to person. And Beecher said this is watching over one another. Rawlins would watch over. And as Beecher said, it would be applying the bands of brotherly discipline. Okay? So Rawlins tells Washburn, look, if Grant has a problem with alcohol, I'm going to resign. Okay, I don't want to, but I will. That's a tough love approach. A brotherly band of discipline. Okay? Well, consider how many of Rawlins's other interventions are reflective in sermon number 6, such as Rawlins policing the camp for the presence of alcohol, and when necessary, prohibiting its use. Hey, that's a societal intervention, but on a small scale. He would extracted a pledge from Grant not to drink, threatened to resign, and kept a vigilant eye over Grant as a concerned other would do, as Lyman Beecher said we need to do. Okay. So did Rawlins's interventions work? Big question. Dan? Somebody's throwing in right now.
Sorry, everyone. That's the points right there. Yeah.
Yeah. What did the interventions work? Who knows? But they probably didn't hurt. In fact, Grant knew that Rawlins was sincerely doing this on his behalf. All right, he's doing me a favor. Okay, he likes me. I'll live with it. But who did it benefit? Well, it benefited people like Lincoln and Stanton, who put so much trust and faith in Grant, and now they knew that there was somebody, a serious foe of drink, who was keeping headquarters dry. Lincoln and Stanton and others now can rest a bit easier, right? Okay. So before we go on, and this is an added attraction that I put on for this talk. Before we go into what Adam Badeau had to say, any questions so far? Or yeah. Question is, did Rawlins drink? Yeah, he did, medicinally speaking. Okay. Yeah. Rawlins came down with TB because his first wife had tuberculosis. Okay. So some doctors that Rawlins would seek treatment from would recommend drink as a medicinal quality of it. Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right, so let's go on to what Adam Badeau had to say. Now, I have to tell you, when I researched this, I was astounded. I think, as Denny said, I've spent my professional career as a counseling psychologist, 20 years teaching counseling to students. And what Badeau had to say about Rawlins's interaction with Grant took me by surprise, because you'll see why in a few minutes. Yeah? All right. So what Badeau has to say to us is something that he regarded as a hallmark of the Grant-Rawlins relationship. I just wish we had more examples, but I can only find this one. Okay? If you know of any others, let me know. All right, and let's talk about it. We have to kind of set the stage for what Badeau will learn. It's January 1868, and Grant and Andrew Johnson are about ready to square off against each other. All right. We know Johnson. All right. Not that we really want to. But we all right. Yeah. Treating the Confederacy, the former states of the Confederacy, with leniency. And he was also trying to get rid of Edwin Stanton, the radical Republican who was the Secretary of War at the time. Okay. And in fact, he booted Stanton out of office, which resulted in the Tenure of Office Act, historically, but I won't get into that. Grant, on the other hand, at this time, was keeping his political views close to the vest. But the Republicans were eager to exploit his popularity. This made Johnson very wary of Grant. And, you know, like you're told to do, you keep your enemies closer, you know, so that you can have control over them. All right. Well, in January 1868, the Senate overturned Johnson's suspension of Stanton. He had appointed Grant as the interim Secretary of War while Stanton was on the sidelines. But much to Johnson's surprise, once the Senate overturned this Tenure of Office Act, Stanton shows up unbeknownst to anybody and takes back his office early one morning. Johnson's enraged. How did he do that? He thought Grant had promised him to hold on to that office until Johnson could name a permanent replacement. All right? And here's Stanton's back. Johnson's, you could fry an egg on his forehead. Johnson and Grant get into a very testy argument about who promised what to whom. This confrontation actually becomes public, shows up in the newspapers, and culminates in a January 31st letter in which Johnson calls Grant a liar publicly. Oh my God. All right. Now, Grant has to pen a rejoinder. All right. So here's the scene. Grant, Rawlins, and Adam Badeau are together in the office while Grant is writing a response to Johnson's calling him a liar. All right. Grant writes the draft, shows it to Rawlins, and Rawlins reads it and says, This will not do. It's not enough. What it was a lukewarm, tepid reply that, according to Badeau, was simply a way to tranquilize the situation. Remember, Grant was a guy who disliked confrontation. He didn't want to pound the desk and get into an argument. But Rawlins, on the other hand, sensed that Grant's honor had been impugned and that Grant was ready to make the break with Johnson. He could sense this. So Rawlins perceived Grant's underlying true sentiments about this situation, the feelings, the thoughts. He had apprehended Grant's hurt and preferred intent. Now, Rawlins helped Grant craft a haymaker of a response back to Johnson to assail Johnson's effort, as this letter said, to destroy my character before the country. Badeau is standing there and watching this. He's dumbstruck. Oh my God, what has just happened? Well, this is in Badeau's own words. He says, Rawlins knew he was expressing Grant's own sentiment, and Grant instantly perceived this fact and acquiesced. I never in my intercourse with Grant saw another exercise so direct and palpable and important an influence on him. Whew. Badeau also said that what Rawlins did was a stroke of political genius, for it made any other candidate than Grant impossible for the Republicans. This is what basically led to the Republicans nominating Grant 5 months or 4 months later for the presidency on their ticket. That letter. All right. Now, this is what really impresses me. What did Rawlins really do here? This is what impresses me as a person who trained counselors for 20 years. Rawlins hadn't inserted his own ideas into Grant. As Badeau said, he got them all first from Grant and would reveal them to him or even impress them on their author. Rawlins, we have now proved, could apprehend Grant's verbal and nonverbal cues and articulate their latent meaning or intent. Counselors call this advanced empathy. Okay? It's a skill that I would teach my students because they needed this when they would work with clients. Like an empathic counselor, Rawlins could accurately capture the feelings and meanings beyond Grant's ken and give them a fuller, more accurate, and concrete expression to them. Very impressive. I wish I had more examples. Okay? But all right. Questions? Yes.
So you start off by suggesting, I think, that whether or not Grant had a drinking problem is a little bit unclear at the beginning of the story. It was clear, though, that he had a drinking problem in California.
I think so. Okay. But that cleared up when he got back to his family, right? Yeah. So, I can hardly imagine what it's like to be on the Pacific coast back then in 1850. Okay. Bad weather, loneliness. He also had, I can't remember the camp commander's name, okay? But he was under the command of an individual who I think was also quite ready and willing to brand Grant as having an alcohol problem because the commander had an issue with Grant personally.
Now, I have a question. I guess twofold. One that kept coming to my mind during the presentation was, how did Halleck see Rawlins? Did he trust him? Did he seek out his opinion on Grant, or did he think that obviously it was right man, he could really
Yeah,
objective opinion from him? Did that come, or, and also if maybe speak to Dana as well, but primarily Halleck, what was, if any, relationship?
from what I can gather, Rawlins didn't have much of a relationship with Halleck. And again, I think you can attribute that to the fact that Halleck was a major general, and Rawlins was a captain and the staff officer. So they're not going to pal around much. Okay. Rawlins did feel that when Halleck took over after Shiloh, okay, Halleck really took Grant to task, said this army is disorganized, it has low morale, I've got to really, put these people into shape and show them how to fight and Rawlins thought that was all well off base, but he's not going to tell Halleck that. I can't remember who was first. I'll go 1, 2.
Okay, he talked about Rawlins's relationship to the guy above him in command. Could you say something about Rawlins's relationship to the people he gave the orders to? I remember just before World War II, General MacArthur found an obscure captain named Sutherland and made him his chief of staff because he said Sutherland is the best ass kicker in the army. Was Rawlins an ass kicker?
Yes, he was. And he would use his profanity to, to get his way. All right. But he could be an ass kicker, but he could also display some very impressive charm. And I think one of the most impressive things he did was when Charles Dana was sent by Stanton to Vicksburg to report back. Okay, Dana was actually Stanton's goal and wanted Dana there to check things out. Okay, Grant's staff, with the exception of Rawlins, wanted to throw Dana into the river, get rid of him. Okay. Rawlins' idea was 180 degrees opposite. We'll treat him with respect. We'll welcome him into the fold. We'll be open to him. We'll tell him about where things are going so that he knows what the plans are. Okay. We'll have dinner with him. We'll set up his tent right next to ours. Okay. And the result of that was Dana became a believer in Grant, passed that on to Stanton. Okay. And Rawlins was in large measure responsible for Dana bringing back good reports out of Vicksburg. Remember too, at Vicksburg, that's where McLernan got canned. Okay. McLernan was a very powerful political general. Okay, he had a lot of friends. And Grant chose Rawlins to be his emissary to DC. After Vicksburg fell, Rawlins went to DC with the report about the Vicksburg campaign, which was extensive. So he had two goals being sent to Washington. One was to report back on the campaign, the success of the campaign, and secondly, to make a case for why McClernand got booted out. And if we see in Gideon Wells's diary, Rawlins succeeded in votes or scores.
You said Rawlins started out as a raceman.
Yeah.
I started thinking.
Well, we know. I don't know what Rawlins's own attitudes were, but remember he was a big supporter of Stephen Douglas, and we know what Douglas thought. Okay, and I'd have to guess that Rawlins's viewpoints weren't that far removed. He was Native American. Yeah, they got along famously. Parker was well respected in Galena. Okay. Before the war, he was also a trained engineer and was responsible for designing, for example, the Galena post office that's still in operation to this day. Okay. He was also whatever he was called, like the president or chief of the, and I don't mean Indian chief, of one of those Masonic lodges in town. Okay. So he had a great deal of respect in town from everyone.
What's, I'm trying to reconcile profanity with this temperance. Was he religious?
Yes.
Talking profanity.
Well, his father knew a good deal of profanity. His father earned a living producing charcoal, burning wood into charcoal that was then used to smelt the lead ore. And his father, and burning this charcoal could be hazardous and dangerous and difficult, chopping the wood. So I'd have to believe that his father could use some, choice words. And in my book, I described the process of producing charcoal. If you didn't pay attention, you might immolate yourself. The other thing, remember that Rawlins would haul this charcoal into town on ox carts. So he would have interactions with people in town. Remember, Galena was a port town. You had all of these rough rivermen in town who also used a lot of profanity. He's gonna learn it.
Did you find, did Rawlins have any desire for command, or did he feel his higher calling was his favorite brand?
He never badgered Grant for command of a regiment or division or anything like that. Although Grant, I think, would have acquiesced if he asked for it. But he was quite satisfied in holding on to his staff position. No, I didn't. And I'll tell you why. Oh, yeah, they're heavy. The distributor, however, doesn't take unsold copies back. So if I brought 10 copies and sold one, I'm stuck. But you can get them off of Amazon, okay, and Barnes and Noble, and the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago sells them, and my autograph is tipped in. So I urge you to get 2, 3,
Always coming up.
Yeah, yeah. You know, every room in the house. All right, yes, question.
Move the big text on your call.